Well, hello, Feely Brain.
Yeah. Well, hello, Thinky Brain. Actually, it's the reverse, but that's fine. We're going with it. We're trying to lean into other parts of ourselves.
We're
Yeah.
mixing it up a little bit today. Well, we got a
Dig it.
great question. Is empathy the best path to being a good manager?
Wow.
Wow, that's a good
Wow.
one.
Yeah. You know
Well,
how I feel about empathy, Katja.
I do. I
Exhausted.
do. We've talked about it before. And actually, I feel similarly. We've had a
Oh.
brief conversation about it, but why don't we
Mm.
do a quick definition? Because people sometimes get confused about these terms, right? We have pity, we have sympathy, we have empathy, and we have compassion. What do you
Yeah.
think?
Yeah, I love
We
it.
have
Go
this
for
little
it.
chart here. So pity is I feel sorry for you, right? So, but I'm glad I'm not you. There's a lot of distance when we talk about pity or when we feel pity. Sympathy, I feel for you, still distance, right? And then empathy, I feel with you. And that's where it gets tricky because we feel the feelings of the other person, and that can be exhausting. We'll talk about that. And then compassion is I'm here to help, recognizing the challenge, the suffering, the difficulty, and feeling moved to action.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I really like that. I like those definitions. I think they make it really clear because I think people conflate all four of those things,
I
you know?
agree. I
Yeah.
agree. And we talk about compassion fatigue, which is a big deal. And I know you talk and think about it a lot because it's closely related to burnout. I think it should actually be called empathy fatigue.
Yeah. And some people do. So there's a study out of Australia, and there's another burnout index called the Sydney Index, and they talk about empathy fatigue as being a characteristic of burnout.
Mm,
And I, as someone who successfully manages my chronic illnesses, the doctor says it's in remission, right? Like, so I'm not dealing with the same direct symptoms, but I have to be very vigilant in maintaining my lifestyle in a certain way so that I don't get tired. I don't slide back into that. And so empathy, feeling other people's feelings is actually causes me to feel physical exhaustion. I think there's some people that are really thinky brained because for whatever reason they aren't good at emotions.
mhm.
But I am the thinky brain. I am thinky as a partially as a matter of self-preservation, right? Because I only have so much energy, and I have some things I got to do, and sometimes feeling all the feels is really difficult for me. But I did get some really interesting. Is it okay if we go in this direction? I did because I feel like you should talk more about this than I. I think that I got some really useful feedback recently that I think directly goes to this question about, is empathy a way to be a good manager? When you're a manager of other people, of their time, and of resources that they need to do their job, uh, being able to feel with them on some level or help them feel like you understand where they're coming from is vital. It's necessary, right? And compassion, it's interesting, Katja, that on your index, compassion is beyond empathy, because for me, compassion is easy, but that's because I'm like a do person.
Yeah.
Like I want to like go and do stuff, I don't want to just talk about it or feel it. But I gave a lecture recently, and a feedback that I got from somebody who I respect. She said, the way you talk about this topic of burnout, you are so inclusive. I was like, what does that mean? She's like, I think everyone actually believes you when you took a moment multiple times during the lecture to say that if you are in chronic stress or in burnout, like when I say to the audience, I just want to take a moment and say that I see you, and that what you were going through is very difficult, and that you deserve, you deserve relief.
Mm.
But I just want to recognize how difficult it is what you're going through. And she said, when you say that, I believe you. And there are other people who say that and they don't believe them. Right. And some of it is because I established that I've been through this process. Right.
Mm.
And so I think that's another thing too about empathy and compassion is like, does it read as being authentic? And a lot of the times when people try to have compassion or whatever, and I know they haven't gone through the same thing that I have, and then they try to say these bromides or whatever, they try to say these platitudes to like help me feel better. I find it irritating because I don't believe them. It's not authentic.
Mhm.
So I think part of it is, you as a leader, particularly as a manager, spending time to understand deeply what does it mean for me to be empathetic, and and compassionate, and how am I expressing it, right? So this is the thinky strategy piece of it, right? Like spending that time, and then also writing things down or giving talks or whatever, and then getting feedback. Does this ring true for you? Do I, am I doing what I'm trying to do, which is to be authentic in human connection? And it's funny because after that lecture, I wasn't exhausted. I don't know each and every one of those people. I knew some of the industries that they worked. There was a huge talk. It was like 350 people, but it was easy for me, for some reason, in that moment, to express empathy versus, I think, maybe on one-on-one. I'm not exactly sure. I think there's, for another time, another talk, we could talk about the physical aspect of empathy fatigue.
Yeah. Well, I have two slightly different topics that come to mind.
Yeah.
So one is the best path. Yeah. Well, I don't think there is a single thing that makes you a good manager, right? It's a multitude of things. So
100%.
is empathy, compassion important? Absolutely. Right. To your point. And I think the other thing that's really important to convey to people, because whenever I talk about compassion, for example, people think it's weak. Right? People think, or sometimes people think it's weak. It just means that you say, oh, poor you, and let people get away with things, right? But when we go back to the definition we have for compassion, recognizing the struggle or the suffering, or understanding it because you've been through it, and then taking action, there's the action element. And action doesn't always mean that you coddle the person. Action could be a little bit of tough love. Right? But it comes from a good place. It comes from a place of care. And so sometimes when I work with psychotherapy clients, there obviously is a lot of suffering. And sometimes I also have to tell them tough things about how they might be contributing to things or their own patterns, or, give them feedback. And so that's not coddling, but it comes out of a mindset of compassion and a feeling state of compassion, of recognizing how challenging it is and helping someone out of that. And that's, in a way, what you're doing with your workshops. You are seeing the suffering, you're creating space for the suffering, you're validating the suffering of burnout, and you're giving people concrete, actionable tools and skills that are very, very strategic, that people can implement. So you're taking the action and you're giving them the tools. Now it's then up to them to use the tools,
to take action.
Like we always say here, everything we talk about here is a practice, and it's a practice that you and I do. Sometimes better, sometimes not so good, right?
That's why it's a practice. That's why it's practice. Sometimes you mess up. Sometimes you mess. I wouldn't call it tough love, though. I mean, maybe other people experience what you're talking about as tough love, but what I'm hearing is that sometimes you have to deliver objective information or even subjective information that might be difficult for the listener to hear. But in order for the listener's suffering to be alleviated, they have to actually be present to those things that you're pointing out as a therapist, right? Like that's how I hear. That doesn't seem like tough love to me, but did I get it right?
That thinky perspective that you put on it, objective data.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Other people are like, objective data is mean. And I'd be like, yeah, but it's objective. So yeah, you're right. It's the thinky brain.
Being direct, right? So really what we're talking about is being direct, not coddling someone, but also not being mean, because we can be direct and it can be cruel or cutting.
Yes.
Right? So I think going back to the skill of a manager is to be able to deliver things in a way that's objective, that's helpful, that maybe is difficult to hear at times, but that's also doesn't come from meanness or judgment, right? So because then, and I think that's maybe why people point that out about you. What you deliver is you're very direct, you're very straightforward, but it comes from a really caring place, actually.
Oh, that's what's going on. Who knew? I mean, I'm trying to figure it out. Yeah, no, I mean, I think also too, this is a piece of like being a good manager. There is a piece of it that is, we can throw out strategies and tactics all day long. And also, well, I'm sure we'll do a talk about authenticity and stuff. There are these things that are sort of squishy, right? Like you can't really measure them, but I do think that, the other thing that my friend told me that was really good feedback was I always strike people as being very sincere. Which that was like the highest compliment anyone could ever give me, because I am a very sincere person and I hold myself to a very high ethical standard. And I think both of these things, people trust those qualities because they feel ethical and fair and safe. They signal safety. And what's interesting in the research of burnout, as we talked about before, especially Dr. Maslach's research, is that fairness and ethics and transparency in those things are one of the elements that dissolve burnout. Because burnout is often the result of a lot of things feeling unethical in an unmitigated way for an extended period of time. So when you're able as a manager to be more overtly fair and ethical, that I think is important. And I think when you are very sincere and ethical and act with deep integrity, like those things, I feel like operationalize this concept of authenticity, right? Because like, what does it mean to be authentic? But I think these are sort of, as I operationalize authenticity in my own leadership brand, as I think of it, it's being extremely sincere, listening deeply, acting with integrity. And I feel like empathy is just then, I don't know, kind of becomes a part of it. Katja, what do you think?
Well, it's funny because as you were talking, I was thinking embodiment. You're embodying this. It's not something you're faking, you're putting out there. You really embody this. And that is so key, right? I can say something as a therapist, but if I'm not embodying it myself or practicing it myself, it's not authentic. And I think that's when we talk about managers. Are you embodying this, right? Are you saying to people, practice good self-care, address your burnout, but you're sending the emails at, 1 a.m. or working yourself to the bone, right? Or never, sharing any vulnerability or expressing any vulnerability, then it can become incongruent. And when something's incongruent, our nervous systems don't tend to trust it. Right?
Yeah, they can tell.
They can tell.
They can tell. Yeah.
They can tell. Right? So then it's maybe better to be honest and say, look, I struggle with this, but I want you to do better than I am doing. Right.
Yeah. Well, people believe that too, I think. Yeah. I think people admitting failure, right? I think that actually can be potentially a part of having more empathy. Just don't fixate on it too much. That's a whole other episode where I will rant about how I think we fixate on the wrong things sometimes, right? Like,
let's do it. I love ranting.
It shouldn't be about failure, but it should be about, being sincere, being sincere in listening to your direct reports or to people on your team or to people in your organization, being really sincere and then being really honest. It's, I feel like another way of, because empathy is amplified, I think, when you have common shared experiences, either that you've experienced in your life in an asynchronous fashion or things that you've experienced together at the same time. It just gives more credibility. But you don't have to have experienced those things to express empathy. You can always say, like you just said, Katja, right? Like the honesty piece of it. Like, I have not experienced what you have experienced. I am hearing you say this, this, and this. I can't imagine what it would be like to go through that. But I need you to know that I see you and I hear you, right? That is, I think, empathy. That is principled empathy. I am acknowledging that you and I have had wildly different experiences. I want to say respectfully to you that I really don't have the ability to even think about what it would be like to go through that. That turn of phrase, by the way, is really important because I have had people say to me when I share certain experiences about my life or certain suffering that I've gone through, that they say, well, I can't even imagine. Gosh, that was so hard what you went through. Okay. When you say that, you have made a judgment and communicated a judgment, whether or not you realize it or not. Right. Like, oh, what a difficult path you took. Like that. No, do not, especially if you're talking to someone like me, who's a Thinky Brain fighter response, don't do it. You just shut off communication with that person.
Right.
But to say, I don't know, I can't wrap my head around that. That's so different from my experiences. But then do the active listening of, I hear you when you say this, this, and this. And I see you, the phrase, I see you. I know sometimes people kind of make fun of it because it's almost overused now, but it's actually it's important because you can convey to that person, I am acknowledging and affirming what you have told me without judgment, without my own judgment. I'm not going to because when you say like, oh, that must be so hard, you're actually centering yourself in the discussion, which is then you're burning up any attempt at goodwill that you might have been trying to have.
Yeah.
And then moving to compassion as quickly as possible, right? Like for me, it's always like, this is really messed up that you went through that. Tell me what you need me to do. How can I help? How can we fix this? How can we change this? Right.
Exactly.
Then you're moving towards action.
Exactly. And especially for a manager, right? You do also have goals you need to accomplish. There is the personal side of the conversation and the care or the empathy or the compassion. And then there is the goals you have. So how can I help you? What do we need to change? How are we
Yes.
going to address this, right? So then action-oriented question that also turn on the prefrontal cortex, the thinking brain, the action-oriented brain, the problem-solving brain. Because when we feel seen, going back to the idea of co-regulation, that's actually super soothing to the nervous system. When we feel truly seen and heard by another, our nervous systems feel calmer.
Yeah. And I also really like that phrase that you just used, which is, how can we change this? And I actually think as a manager, to say something in the compassion phase, which is, after you've acknowledged that person, to say, what can we do together?
Mm.
What can we do together? Those two words are incredibly powerful, because now you are signaling to them, like, your struggle is my struggle.
Right.
Let's
And
fix
you're not
this.
fixing it for them or expecting
Exactly.
them to fix it alone. You're doing this
Exactly.
as a team.
Yes. Yeah. That I feel like is something we need to do more of these days, especially since we just have extraordinary everything bad all the time. Right. And adversity, it's not a great way to develop trust. We shouldn't have to have adverse conditions to develop trust with people. But it also can be a situation where you develop extremely deep connection with people. You have that capacity. You have that capacity as a manager, right? It just has to be handled in a way that's ethical, and with integrity. And so when you say something like, how can we change this in the future? Or how can we change this together? Hopefully when you say that, you mean it. But also you're really doing a lot, not only with building trust, but like you just said, Kachi, it'll probably help someone. It'll send a signal that helps regulate and stabilize a person's nervous system. I think that's really powerful. I feel like I wish we'd think about that a little bit more,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you. Thinky Brain. Appreciate
Yeah.
you.
Thank you, Feely Brain. I appreciate you. I feel like we talked about some good tactics this time. Yeah.
We did. We did indeed.